You are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I'm one of your hosts, Eugene Burrier. I'm soon to be joined here, hopefully, by my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek, but I'll take this moment, of course. Oh, there she is. Rania, good to be back with you.
You wouldn't believe what just happened, Eugene.
I think I would, but do you want to enlighten me?
I do. So as soon as we went live, electricity goes out.
Oh, we're being sabotaged.
Okay. And then the generator turns on, but then the camera is needing to be restarted. So my apologies. I didn't even notice.
It's okay. It was fast. It was quick. I'm glad it was
literally
resolved.
as soon as we went, as soon as the music started, electricity's out.
Wow.
Anyway,
I wish I had
it was very,
the rights to the Beastie Boys Sabotage. Would be a great time to play that. Nonetheless, anyway, I'm very glad you're here. Glad you're with us.
You. Yes.
Of course.
Here we are.
Well, I was just taking the second while you disappeared briefly to remind people that this would be a good time to hit subscribe as they watch on YouTube so they can get access to all of our great cognac. Whoa, we are not offering free cognac content. Like Rania Khalek's dispatches. A little Joe Biden there. My words running in together as I move too fast. Right. Name one person who would replace Rania Khalek as the host of this show. Name one.
Joe Biden.
We'll get to that. But definitely hit the bell so that dispatches from Rania Khalek and perhaps even cognac will be brought to you very quickly as soon as it comes out. And, definitely also a good time to let whoever is following you know that they can follow us, that we're here, however you want to do so. Carrier pigeon, warning shot, knocking on your neighbor's door, whatever seems right.
Stuff, yeah.
Whatever it takes. Let them know that we're here and we are on. And Rania, what else should our viewers know?
Well, there's a couple things. First of all, they can support this program as well as all of our other excellent work at Breakthrough News by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And I do apologize. I didn't get an update on where we're at with the patrons. We have a campaign going. If we can get 50 new patrons in the month of February, Eugene will start an Instagram account, which is something that the people want. We've heard your pleas. We're trying to make it happen. So I knew last week we were halfway there. I'm not sure where we are at this week, but we're still not quite there. So if you want to see Eugene per year, as I do, on Instagram, then become a patron at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And you can push Eugene in that direction. And I want to be clear here. Eugene on Instagram would mean he posts. He's not just going to start an Instagram account and it just stays there lurking. He will actually post content.
Wow, that's saying a lot.
Yeah.
Well, let's just hope we make it, even though we don't know the number. But that just means, give early and give often because we don't know what's going on. So definitely make sure you hit subscribe, hit the bell for the alerts. Patreon.com/Breakthrough News. You want to become a patron. And of course, just below this screen, you'll see you have the ability to donate in real time here as the show goes forward. But as we move the show forward, Rania, the biggest story still in the world, and rightfully so, is the aftermath of the earthquake that hit Turkey and Syria. It's only getting worse. We've surpassed 20,000 dead, about 17,000, just over that in Turkey, and just over 3,000 in Syria. Innumerable number of buildings destroyed. I mean, I don't know if it's possible that you can overstate the level of devastation. I'm sure we've seen the terrible photos coming out and, the young babies being pulled from rubble. I saw a place in, I think outside of Aleppo where 100 people were buried alive. I mean, it's every time you turn around, there's some just very tragic story. And there's so many levels to it, Rania, of course, but I think maybe for viewers of this show, one that a lot of people are thinking about is the impact of sanctions, which is, of course, on Syria, not on Turkey. But, obviously that, in addition to the cold weather and other things, is putting a huge crimp on the ability to get aid to Syria. I know some is trickling in and people are doing the best they can. And I know there's a lot of challenges in Turkey too with aid delivery and government mismanagement. But it is a reminder, I think, these tragedies kind of reminds me of the Cuba fire issue last year, Rania, that these countries that are so heavily sanctioned in these crises, it's already bad, but it can only, it's so bad, almost unimaginably bad when you put it all together, when you can't bring in any construction materials, food, blankets, tents, water, medicine, and so on.
Yeah, it's really horrible. I mean, I'm in Beirut, Lebanon, which is much further south to where the earthquake, like the epicenter of the earthquake was in Turkey. And so it wasn't so affected. I mean, I did wake me up. It was scary. I felt it, but it was like a 4.5 or something in Beirut, which just made buildings shake. Whereas in northern Syria, in other parts of Syria, obviously across Idlib, across Aleppo, in Latakia as well, just complete devastation, much as we see in Turkey, as well as like buildings collapsing in the aftermath, some flooding caused. I mean, just complete and utter devastation. And of course, this is happening in a country that has, just endured an over decade-long war, much of which was provoked by the United States, basically having this, covert, dirty war on Syria, where it was funding and arming a bunch of gangs of extremists to try to overthrow the government. And in the process, the country descended into horrible civil war. And you mentioned sanctions. I mean, obviously what's happened in Turkey is terrible, but countries around the world are donating. NGOs, organizations around the world are donating. Organizations in the US and Canada and across Europe are able to send aid, to send donations in large quantities if they want to. Whereas in Syria, things are a bit different. You have the opposition areas in Idlib, which of course are accessible by Western aid organizations. You are able to donate to various opposition NGOs that operate across Idlib. However, in Syrian government areas, it's quite the opposite. Syria's already, people who follow dispatches may have seen, I interviewed the UN Special Rapporteur on coercive unilateral measures or on sanctions a couple of months ago after she had visited Syria for like a 2-week visit to survey the impact of sanctions across the country. So even before this earthquake, Syria is suffering horrible fuel shortages. People don't have gasoline to put in their cars or fuel to heat their homes. There was already a shortage in medical supplies and hospital equipment that people were dealing with, as well as problems with food security. Much of Syria is now food insecure. It wasn't before. But the point is to say the country's already struggling with these problems. Imagine now an earthquake that's collapsing buildings and rescue vehicles don't have gasoline to get to people. You don't have the kinds of industrial equipment that you can power, like cranes and other things, to get people from under the rubble like you do in Turkey or even northern Syria. And on top of that, you have people who can't return to their homes because they're scared of structural damage, living outside in tents. I mean, obviously the medical system doesn't have the capacity to deal with the level of injuries or, the dead who are coming through. I mean, this has killed over 20,000 people at this point. Many of those people are in Syria, and organizations are not able to help them. And the U.S. government is lying. Like, they're lying. Well, they even had one of their State Department spokesperson release a video in Arabic, insisting that sanctions are not an obstacle to humanitarian aid. But that is not true. I know from a fact, just from people and organizations asking me how best they can help people in Syria, that the only way to help people in Syria right now, if you are in Europe or the United States, is to send money to like somebody in Lebanon, an individual, or supplies to an individual in Lebanon, and then they have to take it into the country physically. Certainly not a system where you can get large quantities of aid into a country that desperately needs it urgently and immediately to save lives. So people are dying because of these sanctions, and the media in the US doesn't seem to care. They're talking about this earthquake, back to back, hour to hour, updating the death toll, but they're acting like sanctions aren't a problem. And it's absolutely shameful and disgusting that the United States can sit there and lie and say that they're doing nothing to prevent aid from coming through and in fact stand with the Syrian people, when what they need to do is immediately lift these sanctions.
No, I agree. I couldn't say it better than that. I think that it's obviously a glaring, I don't know what to call it, a glaring error in the, world order that you can do this kind of thing and strangle people in this way. And this is always par for the course. They say, oh, well, it has nothing about humanitarian aid, but that's not how sanctions work. But I would definitely encourage people to check out your interview on Dispatches, which I think, breaks it all down. I wish I would have told someone to drop it in the chat, but maybe one of our intrepid viewers can find that and drop it in the chat for people who haven't seen it, because I think that it really lays out not only the context of Syria, but I think shows how natural disaster in any of these countries that are sanctioned can be so devastating. So we'll continue to follow and cover it as best we can, and things that are happening there and as weeks go by, but terrible situation. Like I said, over 20,000 dead there in Turkey and Syria, and it's only going up as rubble continues to be cleared. Well, Rania, turning the page here, the other big story here in the United States, at least, and I guess in some sense around the world, given how the U.S. dominates so much, is President Biden's State of the Union address, which took place this past Tuesday, February 7th. There's a lot that can be said about the State of the Union. I mean, by and large, since Congress is now split, the Republicans control the House, the Democrats control the Senate, there's very little that's going to happen in there. And this was really, in many ways, I think, a preview by President Biden of, essentially how the Democrats are going to try to set up the narrative for the 2024 campaign, more of which can be said. But I would say the one issue that did come out in the State of the Union that is very much at issue vis-a-vis this issue of the debt ceiling and, what Republicans are going to try to, get Democrats to cut from the budget is Social Security and Medicare, which are the old age insurance for those who don't know, and health care for older Americans. And this is a big issue. It's always a big issue, cutting them. Republicans want to cut them. They've been saying they want to cut them, but now they're pretending they don't. Either way, it became a big topic of discussion at the State of the Union itself. There was a little bit of an exchange on that, and we want to bring that to you.
Some Republicans want Medicare and Social Security to sunset. I'm not saying it's a majority. Let me give you, anybody who doubts it, contact my office. I'll give you a copy. I'll give you a copy of the proposal. That means Congress doesn't vote. Well, I'm glad to see you. No, I tell you, I enjoy conversion. It means if Congress doesn't keep the programs the way they are, they'd go away. Other Republicans say, I'm not saying it's a majority of you. I don't even think it's even a significant, but it's being proposed by individuals. I'm not politely not naming them, but it's being proposed by some of you. Look, folks, the idea is that we're not going to be moved into being threatened to default on the debt if we don't respond. Folks, as we all apparently agree, Social Security and Medicare is off the books now, right? They're not to be stopped. All right. I'm ready. We got unanimity. Social Security and Medicare are a lifeline for millions of seniors. Americans have to pay into them from the very first paycheck they started. So tonight, let's all agree, and we apparently are, let's stand up for seniors. Stand up and show them. We will not cut Social Security. We will not cut Medicare. Those benefits belong to the American people. They earned it. And if anyone tries to cut Social Security, which apparently no one's going to do, and if anyone tries to cut Medicare, I'll stop them. I'll veto it. And look, I'm not going to allow them to be taken away. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. But apparently it's not going to be a problem.
Well, I have to say, big win actually for President Biden, because the Republicans actually do want to cut Medicare and Social Security. President Trump sent them a message a couple weeks ago saying, don't do this under any cost, because no one is for putting more seniors deeper into poverty. And it looks like, the MAGA caucus, by coming out and attacking President Biden, yelling at him, gave him the opportunity to grandstand there. And now whether they'll take it off the table or not is a whole other question. But, it does speak to how ridiculous the U.S. government is that this, Rania, is basically the only issue where probably something is going to happen in 2023 because of the debt ceiling, is like there's going to be a debate over whether or not to send seniors deeper into poverty or not.
Yeah, no, I have to give Biden credit for that, for those theatrics, because it was like it was a good move. It was a good move. But that said, it's not as though Democrats don't have people in their ranks that want to cut Social Security as well, or make the retirement age, or increase the retirement age so that you have to wait longer to access Social Security. So unfortunately, like, the party that's supposed to be protecting it isn't even that strong on protecting it. And of course, we know Republicans lie, about that issue, because they're constantly trying to cut Social Security. So, we'll have to wait and see what happens. It was nice to see that play out, but words are just words, honestly, when it comes to this issue. And Biden himself has actually, in the past, it's great if he's no longer a proponent of it, but in the past, he has been a proponent of cutting Social Security.
Well, there was definitely some sophistry from Biden about what he was going to do. And one of the big issues, of course, was around lead poisoning, which is obviously, ever since we saw what's happened with Flint, Michigan, been a big topic of discussion in the United States. And he did say something about that is basically not true. So we want to play that clip right now.
Look, we're also replacing poisonous lead pipes that go into 10 million homes in America, 400,000 school and child care centers. So every child in America can drink the water instead of having permanent damage to their brain.
Now, good. I'm all for that. And he's not lying exactly that they're going to try to replace lead pipes going into schools and daycare. But here's the rub. So they're spending $15 billion in the infrastructure bill, Rania, to replace lead pipes in the U.S. The problem is, though, to replace all the lead pipes that are poisoning kids, you need to spend $45 to $47 billion. So they're tens of billions of dollars below what's necessary. So I hope that fewer kids will be drinking from school water fountains and daycares that have water that's poisoned with lead. But quite frankly, they might end up going right back to their house and drinking water that's poisoned with lead. And let's remember, there is no safe level of lead in water. There is no safe level. So even though it sounds good and it's a great campaign speech there from President Biden, and you could say this about a number of things he was proposing, but that one really stood out to me, Rania, because we're talking about poisoning children here, and the fact that the U.S. government could not come up with enough money to prevent children being poisoned. $45 billion, that's less money than they give into Ukraine. But nonetheless, here we are pretending that we're going to save kids when that's not what's happening.
Why is there even lead in the water in the first place? Like, what? It's like so many. No, it's ridiculous. This is supposed to be the richest country in the world, and you have many cities that have lead problems, like, around the level. I don't know how bad it is. There was one AP report not too many years ago about a number of cities having lead levels worse than Flint, Michigan, which was pretty shocking, because obviously we know what happened in Flint. But yeah, why is this even an issue? Like, it's just shocking the amount of money we can spend on the military budget, the amount of money we can send to aid Ukraine, like shower the country with weapons. But like you said, even like a half of that, I think we've sent $80 billion or more that we know of to Ukraine. But we can't spend $40 billion to, like, make sure children aren't poisoned. It's incredible.
Seems very straightforward. But, you think about the things that they didn't do. And like, I don't know, some people would say Biden did originally propose $40-some billion, and it was Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema and the like who helped tank that. So, they also deserve some criticism for sure beyond Biden. But to misrepresent it like that, I thought was so criminal on so many different levels. And yeah, the double standards of just how quick everyone's quick to jump, to attention and send cash to Zelensky, who seems to have a never-ending appetite for other people's stuff. Right now there's 2.1 million internally displaced people in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo where fighting is happening. Last year, they only got 46%, the UN Human Rights Council, of what they asked for humanitarian relief. Now they're asking for $233 million. Looks like they might not get that. But, Zelensky bats an eyelash and he gets $25 billion. So it tells you something. But before we move off the State of the Union or off some of the clips from the State of the Union, there's more we do want to talk about in relationship to it. There was one, listen, I think we all can admit that Biden had a very spirited performance. Maybe he got a good night's sleep. Maybe, he got some pharmaceutical assistance. But there was one moment that I think stood out to a lot of people. One, because it was in the context of him promoting the new Cold War. But two, it was let's just play this clip about Biden and China and Xi Jinping and then come back.
But make no mistake about it. As we made clear last week, if China threatens our sovereignty, we will act to protect our country, and we did. Look, let's be clear. Winning the competition should unite all of us. We face serious challenges across the world. But in the past 2 years, democracies have become stronger, not weaker. Autocracy has grown weaker, not stronger. Name me a world leader who changed places with Xi Jinping. Name me one. Name me one.
I think a lot of world leaders would be happy to trade places with Xi Jinping.
Yes, I think every world leader of any country that's not rich and powerful would probably be like, I'd love to be the president of China. I mean, which is so bizarre. And when watching it, I mean, it was like crickets in the room because I think people were like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Several people have surmised that he was maybe trying to say something else, like what world leader would stand up to him or something like that. But just a classic Bidenism.
I mean, it was just a really dumb thing to say because if world leaders were in the room, I think you would have had a huge show of hands.
Yes, I think so, for sure.
I even think some European leaders might be like, oh, that would be like, I mean, China's a rising power. It's got a huge, massive economy. It's a very powerful country. Yeah. And it's a well-functioning country. So
yeah, I hear you. And, definitely a lot of European leaders who apparently have just given their country over to America, it seems.
Yeah, and China has not.
Volkswagen is thinking about moving to the United States, their corporate headquarters. I don't know if that's real. They might just be floating that to get more money from the German government. But I heard it. It's a rumor. I don't know if it's real. But it does show how ridiculous this is getting. Well, we want to bring in Kay Pritzker, who is with us here at Breakthrough News, to talk about sort of a subsidiary element of this that came up. A lot of people have discussed the sort of issue of Biden's sort of State of the Union being very aimed more towards working class people, a lot on the wealthy paying their fair share. And one thing that he laid out was the stock buyback tax, which was just instituted last year, being quadrupled. And that's an issue that I feel deserves more coverage overall. That's why we bring in Kay Pritzker here from Breakthrough News, who follows this issue closely, because share buybacks really are one of the ways that, the rich keep getting richer that most people don't know about, Kay. So welcome to the show.
Hey guys, glad to be here.
Well, just to get into it, Kay, I think a lot of people are happy to hear it sounded good in the State of the Union. We're going to quadruple the share buyback tax, but I think a lot of people probably were like, "What is that exactly?" So, what are these share buybacks, and why are they bad?
Yeah, so there's a tax on share buybacks now because of the Inflation Reduction Act. Biden proposed raising that 1% tax to 4%. But the reason they're bad and the reason they've become controversial lately is because they're basically, as you said, Eugene, a way to make the rich richer. So it's, as the name implies, it's when a company buys back shares of its stock in order to boost the stock price, thereby boosting the investors in that company. And, as a company, you want people to invest in your stock. So you want people to think, investors to think that you're going to do things to pump up the price. So the way it works is, let's say there's a company that's issued 100 stocks or 100 shares in the company. If I buy one of those shares, I own one share out of 100. So I own 1% of the company. But if that company then does a share buyback and buys back 50 shares, now I own one of 50 outstanding shares. So now I own 2% of the company. And you can see right there, just by buying back these stocks, the company has basically doubled the value of my stock portfolio, of the stock that I hold. And it's become controversial because it's also kind of a way to evade taxes. I mean, the main reason you're seeing a record number of share buybacks in corporate America now is because the capital gains tax on share buybacks is much lower than the capital gains tax on dividends, which is a more direct form of just paying shareholders a portion of the profits. So, it's basically a way of skirting taxes. And that's what Biden is proposing, fighting. Whether or not he will accomplish it is yet to be seen.
Mm-hmm.
And where does Nancy Pelosi and her husband fit into this? I actually don't know. All I know about Nancy Pelosi and her husband, I don't know. Does her husband like help with stock buybacks? Just because I know it's like a different issue, but I know he's made a lot of money off of what people claim might have been insider trading. Who knows? But I assume politicians are getting
I'll put it to you
rich
like
off of
this. Here's how they're connected to it, Rania.
Okay.
10% of American households own 89% of all stocks. So the only people who own stocks are people like Paul Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi, who have hundreds of millions of dollars by and large. There's a handful of other retail investors, blah, 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 blah. But basically it's just rich people giving money back to rich people, which I think is the other element of this, Kay, is the CEOs of these companies also benefit massively from stock buybacks vis-a-vis the issue of dividends.
Yes. So there are a lot of CEOs now that written into their contract is that they get paid more based on how much they increase the share price. And for people who don't know, companies in the US actually have a legal responsibility to maximize the profits of their shareholders. So they're actually legally liable to not, provide the best service to the customer or to, do the right thing. They are legally bound to boost profits for the people that invest in the company. So this leads to a lot of very, seemingly contradictory outcomes or bad outcomes. I think, for example, you've seen the massive cancellation of flights, Southwest Airlines over the winter break. There were massive flight cancellations. 90%, I think it was, of flights were canceled. And this was because of underinvestment in the company. They didn't have enough staff, so they didn't have enough people working that weekend. But they also failed to invest in their IT infrastructure over the course of years. So their phone lines were down that entire weekend. You had different airports that couldn't reach each other, and they had to cancel these flights. This obviously could have been prevented by investing in infrastructure, investing in the staff of the company, but they didn't do that. Southwest Airlines spent $6 billion for share buybacks from 2016 to 2019. Another example of this is Abbott, which is one of the major baby formula producers in the US. People will remember there was a massive baby formula shortage last year. Not only was there not enough baby formula, but there was also massive batches of Abbott baby formula that was recalled because it was there was poison in them. There was bacteria in them that actually ended up killing 2 children who consumed Abbott baby formula. And again, this was because of underinvestment, because Abbott's factories were falling apart, because they didn't have the oversight to make sure that all of the product that they were putting out was clean. But Abbott did find $5 billion to do share buybacks in 2021. So it just goes to show how these share buybacks, it's a direct attack on the working class. It's akin to austerity, because in a capitalist economy, we don't rely on the government to make baby formula or to build airlines or to build an airline infrastructure. We rely on the private sector. But the problem is the for-profit private sector has an incentive, a legal incentive that's built into the law to not to get people where they need to go or to make sure babies, live to see adulthood. They have a legal requirement to maximize the profit that the shareholders make. So instead of investing in the infrastructure, instead of doing the right thing, or putting money into technology or into hiring workers to make sure things get done, they do these stock buybacks and essentially just shovel more money into the pockets of the ultra wealthy. So some might call that an irreconcilable contradiction in the capitalist system.
Some might.
Can you? Yeah, no, I'm just also curious about the tax avoidance element of this. I mean, you're saying that Biden wants the corporate stock buyback tax rate to be 4%. What is it now? And yeah, I mean, that's also the other way. It would be an attack on the working class because you're also denying revenue to the US government on these massive profits that are being like inflated.
Yeah. So just last year, when the Inflation Reduction Act passed, one of the measures was that there would be a 1% tax on stock buybacks. So every time a company buys back stocks, however much value in stock that they buy, 1% of that goes to the federal government. 1%.
That's crazy.
But before that, there was never a tax on stock buybacks. And that's why so many companies started doing it since the Reagan administration. That's when they were allowed to go forward. A lot of companies started to do it because there is a tax on dividends, which is when you're an investor, you hold a stock, the company pays you. There's a tax on those dividends, but there was no tax on stock buybacks. So the Biden administration got this Inflation Reduction Act passed, which was, I think many people would see that as a positive thing, but it was only 1%. And now raising it to 4%, I don't think there's any real popular will in Congress to do that. Certainly all the corporations are going to fight tooth and nail to, kill this reduction. But at the end of the day, it's a 4% tax. 96% would still go right into the pockets of the shareholders. So yeah, buybacks, dividends, offshore bank accounts, it's all just another strategy for the rich to use all these financial tricks to game the system to enrich themselves.
Yeah.
Nope, I think that's a very, very good point. I just thought this might be interesting, but Market Watch, which is a project of the Wall Street Journal, says that the Biden administration's new stock buyback tax will have little impact on the overall stock market. So that 4%, which is what they're talking about, is not seen by the actual corporations and the other people on Wall Street as being enough money to change anything about exactly what you're saying, Kay, as it concerns Southwest and these other companies disinvesting in the issue. But important issue, interesting one, shows that the rich getting richer certainly is built into the system. Kay Pritzker of Breakthrough News, as always, we really appreciate you being willing to join us here in the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's this is the theme allegedly of, especially if you read the New York Times, of Biden's speech, right? Is there, and the way the White House is rolling it out is the blue collar agenda for working America or something. I forget exactly. It has some name. It doesn't matter. But doing things like this that are designed to look like they're really sticking it to the man, if you will, but that at the end of the day aren't in any way, shape, or form changing the status quo.
Right. And that makes sense. How do we get on? What we should have asked Kay is how do we all get in on the stock buyback game?
Yeah. Well, you have to own a large amount of stock, so it's kind of like you got to spend money to make money.
I don't know. Look, I'm just trying to lift myself up by my bootstraps, Eugene.
Yes, that is exactly how it's done. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And most CEOs are getting paid through stock options now. So if you boost the value of your own stock, it's basically like voting yourself a raise, essentially. But yeah, I do this every couple months. I just Google stock buybacks or share repurchases, they're sometimes called. And you just go to the news tab of Google News and you'll always just see like a bunch of companies announcing $60 billion, $10 billion, $20 billion, all these different things, and it really is just crazy. All the oil companies are doing big stock buybacks now, after their record profits last year.
Definitely something to think about as you're filing your taxes this year. And I'm sure that the income you're paying taxes on is not in the billions, and you're probably paying a way higher tax rate than certainly the stock buybackers, but also the CEOs who are making bank. I mean, just the level of the number of legal loopholes that our representatives allow for so that these people with just immense wealth, it's just get to keep all of it and make more and more money off of it. It's completely absurd. And then while we're talking about not enough money to fix lead, like to take lead out of the water so we don't poison children. It's unbelievable.
It really is unbelievable. I mean, you got to laugh to keep from crying, because it is really amazing that, basically they can just shovel it. And the thing is then they always complain, the corporations, oh, I can't believe you want to raise taxes. How are you going to raise taxes? We're all going to shut down. Our lives are going to be over. I mean, it's just the biggest subset of lies that has ever been told. And when you look at all these little things they do, to get rich and to avoid taxes and all of that, you see how fake it is. But nonetheless, it's still more or less the agreed upon fiction that the media follows, because whenever there's a controversy in Congress over taxes, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, they're always going to both sides it and say, well, some people have concerns that it could do X, Y, and Z. And then they find some, always this professor of economics from George Mason or Columbia Business School who's going to tell them how, this is terrible, with no facts, no figures, no nothing.
No, the economics department at George Mason specifically is basically funded by the Koch family.
Yeah.
But no, it's like, look, I mean, if we don't let these CEOs keep billions of dollars, they might have to still buy everything that they're going to buy, because you know what? They can still afford new yachts. They can still afford a bowling alley in their 18th home. Like, these people are just so excessively wealthy. It's obscene. It's obscene.
It is. Well, to turn the page to another thing that is obscene, that is the ever expanding. You think there's nowhere else they could go? The ever expanding U.S. military machine, especially in Asia, where the U.S. is really raising the war tensions, especially in the Philippines. And we are very happy to be joined as we continue the conversation about U.S. military bases in the Philippines by Tabitha Ponciano, who is the National Vice Chair of the Malaya Movement USA. Tabitha, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we are really honored to have you here. And, this story kind of flashed in the news in the U.S., but then kind of fell out really quickly. So maybe just for those who haven't heard or haven't seen it, what are these new U.S. plans as it concerns military bases in the Philippines?
Yeah, so just a few days ago, the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin announced that they will be adding 4 new military bases in the Philippines, adding to the already 5 that they have access to in the Philippines. These military bases aren't like other U.S. bases that the U.S. has around the world. These bases are part of an agreement that the Philippines has with the U.S. called the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, meaning they're not permanent bases, which is something that they like to highlight about these agreements. The U.S. is basically renting out land and bases from the Philippine government and the Philippine Armed Forces of the Philippines, from which they can operate under no guidance or oversight from the Philippine government.
Can you walk us through a little bit of the history of U.S. involvement in the Philippines, which I know is a really big question because we're talking about a very long history, but just, to give our audience, for those who aren't so familiar, it's, we do learn about U.S. Colonization of the Philippines very briefly in school in the U.S., but it's not covered so much in depth. Can you give us just a brief overview of the U.S. experience in the Philippines?
So the U.S. has had vested interest and presence in the Philippines and in the Asia-Pacific region for over 150 years. In the Philippines, they actually essentially brokered a deal with Spain in 1898 as the Filipino people were fighting for our independence from Spanish colonization. The U.S. kind of stepped in and annexed the Philippines from Spain, which resulted in the Philippine-American War that led to over 200,000 deaths of Filipino civilians on top of military forces. 200,000 deaths is also a conservative estimate of actually how much U.S. military, how much of that U.S. aggression actually resulted in. And for about 45 years or so, since the Philippines was annexed to the U.S., the Philippines essentially was a colony of the U.S. Up until 1946, where it was granted nominal independence. Because what we understand of the relationship of the Philippines to the U.S. is that it's very entangled. And the U.S. has continued to have presence and some sort of influence over the Philippines since then, supporting the former dictator Ferdinand Marcos as he launched the martial law in the Philippines, and until he was actually airlifted by the U.S. In the 80s to save him and his family from the Filipino people who said enough of that. But time and again, they've kind of just come back either through political arrangements, these visiting forces agreements, but also this Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA. And there's more to say, obviously.
Yeah, no, we would teach a semester-long class on this. Unfortunately, the U.S. has done so much meddling. And, one aspect of this that I hope you could talk more about is, what's the impact of these bases? Because I think a lot of times people hear, oh, U.S. bases, and they just kind of think, oh, U.S. bases, and they don't think about the people who live in and around them.
Yeah, for sure. Lloyd Austin actually said that, just a quote from him is that these sites should not be a cause for concern because they will spur economic investments, joint protection, and preservation of our maritime and natural resources, which is, as we know, is not completely true. Military presence in the Philippines has resulted in a number of human rights violations. Particularly, one that I would like to highlight is the murder of Jennifer Laude by U.S. Marine Joseph Scott Pemberton in 2014. This happened around an area of the Philippines that has longstanding military presence, U.S. military presence. And Jennifer Laude, a trans woman, was violently murdered by Joseph Scott Pemberton, and has, kind of gotten off without too much of a unscathed, relatively and comparatively to Jennifer Laude, who he murdered. We've also seen the environmental degradation and impacts of U.S. military, like warships, Navy presence in and around Philippine territory, among other things. There's just been widespread condemnation of their presence because of these human rights violations, the environmental impacts of their presence. So it is not without concern that they will continue to exist in the Philippines.
And can you talk a bit about the current president, who's actually the son of Marcos, who you mentioned?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Marcos Jr. really is taking a lot of inspiration from his father. Again, the former dictator in the Philippines who implemented martial law in the Philippines from the 70s into the 80s. Marcos Jr., unlike his predecessor, Rodrigo Duterte, who was a dictator in his own right and killed so many Filipinos, Marcos Jr. is a very diplomatic and respectable head of state who can talk like any other, and gain the respect through his very sort of like, the way that he speaks, the eloquence that he brings to the table. But he has spent the last 6 months since he took office in June, really parading all over the world and really selling the Philippines bit by bit to whatever highest bidder would like their own land and access to the Philippines. And for the most part, Marcos Jr. has been just continuing a lot of the policies that Duterte put in place, namely, or most, critically, the war on drugs in the Philippines that resulted in over 30,000 killings of mostly those who live in urban poor communities in the Philippines. He's also spent millions and millions of Philippine money, taxpayer money, to travel all over the world with huge entourages. all the while he sits as the Secretary of Agriculture, and the price of, maybe folks have seen, the price of onions in the Philippines are skyrocketing. They're about like 10. It got to up to a point of being about $10 to a kilo, which is an insane amount for a country that is under so much economic distress. He is really a picture, an image of his father, and is really continuing that legacy of fascist dictatorship.
Well, and one of the things I wanted to pick up on exactly on that point is, what the situation is like for social activists, which I know, there are many, many people who raise their voices in the Philippines against these policies. And I know historically they're very targeted, and certainly under Duterte that made big international news. And I wonder if the situation is more or less the same.
Yeah, it really has continued. And I think, the really sinister part about the political repression and what it looks like under Marcos Jr. is that he's much quieter about his about the things that he's doing to actually silence activists, human rights organizers, human rights defenders, environmental justice organizers. He kind of leaves it up to those lower in the totem pole of Philippine governance. And he doesn't respond to questions about accountability or justice for any of those that are being targeted. What he's also done is actually export this political repression to the U.S., where my organization, Malaya Movement USA, has been what we called terror tagged or red tagged. Essentially, we're called a terrorist organization or a terrorist front. Really trying to silence the criticisms and the dissent from the Philippines and overseas. So yeah, continuing the policies that Duterte set in place, and what really the Filipino people experienced under martial law under his father.
And then, I'm just curious how the narrative around this being, because, of course, the way this is being reported in the Western media is that this completes the arc of the U.S. encirclement of China, right? So there's obviously this broader geopolitical Cold War politics that are playing out here. And I'm curious, is that Cold War narrative being invoked in the media in the Philippines as well, to say this is necessary to do because of China?
Yeah, for sure. I think for us in Malaya Movement and other progressive organizations here in the U.S. and in the Philippines, we've been seeing the encroachment of China onto Philippine territory as well. And so the violence and aggression that's coming from China onto Philippine territory is matched, and is something that is matched in the sort of consciousness of the Filipino people. And so the U.S. Sort of pivot to Asia that happened back in 2012, and the continued presence of the U.S. in the Philippines is definitely something that is something that people are thinking about and are recognizing, and it really is a continuation of the U.S.'s strong relationship with the Philippines. But I think we really are adamant that the U.S. and China's is basically using the Philippines as a pawn in their geopolitical schemes, and to the detriment of the Filipino people.
Yeah, it seems like such a similar story. The Philippines, so strategically located in the context of so many things and always finding itself in the middle. But I'm glad you mentioned the issue. Malaya Movement USA, I know you all are doing a lot of work on this front. For people who are just hearing about this and maybe want to offer you all some support, where could they go? Where can they find out more?
Yeah, they can find us on all of the social media pages at Malaya Movement on Instagram and Facebook. We also have a website, malayamovement.com. And just also want to share that our partners in Buy in USA are actually holding a National Day of Action on February 11th to denounce these military bases that are being put up. It's really an important thing for us here in the U.S. specifically to denounce the expansion of U.S. military bases in the Philippines and all over the world to make our voices and our tax dollars heard. And so hopefully folks can join us on our National Day of Action.
Mm-hmm, right on. Tabitha Ponciano, National Vice Chair of Malaya Movement USA. Thanks so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, Philippines, always caught in it. One thing that was mentioned about Marcos that I think people should look up if you're curious about it is check out the People's Power Revolution. That's what kicked the first Marcos out. An amazing movement there that, of course, still going, the National Democratic Movement and other things like that. But an interesting moment in the history of the 80s that a lot of people don't know in terms of resistance. But, yeah, the possibility for war in the South China Sea and in Southeast Asia and Asia more broadly is only growing.
You know what's always so striking to me is how the U.S. will do this thing where it will invoke, like, we have to militarize all of these areas everywhere in the world because of, like, in this case, because of China, right? Like, we have to do this because of China, because of Chinese aggression. But I'm just, like, wondering, like, how many Chinese bases are outside of China?
I think there's one, right? Djibouti.
Like,
I think that's the
it's
only
like
one.
in the,
I think there's another
but
one
the
maybe coming somewhere.
Like, I don't know, but the one in Djibouti is also, like, I think everyone has a base in Djibouti. It's like,
actually true. France does. The United States does. A couple other countries do.
Right.
It's kind of like
Not
the
to make it
Djibouti.
okay. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting too if you look at what's happening right now in Somaliland, which is not a real country but is trying to break away from Somalia. The way they are lobbying there for it in the U.S. and the U.K. is they're like, well, we're reliable. They have a big port there, the Berbera port, and they're like, we're reliable and we'll do whatever the West needs. And you can't trust Djibouti because they have the Chinese in there, and so the national security of the U.S. and the U.K. is actually threatened by using the city of Djibouti, the port of Djibouti, which is the main port for the Horn of Africa. It's threatened by that. So you need to support the secession of Somaliland because we're going to be like a U.S. satrapy. So if you see any of this Somaliland trying to be free, blah, blah, blah stuff on the internet, just know that this is an attempt to undermine really many other countries, but certainly, to push forward the new Cold War. But it's quite a situation.
That's actually good to know. And it just is really striking. I just can't imagine how you can how people can buy the justification that we have to have like all these new military bases to fight back against the non-existent Chinese military bases that literally aren't even in their own like region of the world. It's just.
And America would never accept that. They'll put a base anywhere, and if anyone gets mad, they're like, "What are you saying? No, we can."
It's our sovereignty. Anywhere. It's like an attack on my sovereignty if I can't have 800 military bases around the world.
It's amazing. Well, turning the page here, but sticking on the issue of sovereignty. Especially how, development economics and debt and other things play into this, the IMF and the World Bank. We want to talk a little bit about special drawing rights at the IMF, which you probably have never heard of, but you should know more about and what it means and what it could potentially mean for development in the developing world. Sorry for the redundancy there, but very, very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Andres Arauz, who's a former Ecuadorian central banker, also a research fellow at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and many, many other superlatives I could list. Very accomplished man. Mr. Arauz, thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, how are you? I'm happy to join you guys and talk about these very important issues.
Well, we're doing great, and we're really happy to have you here. And we want to get into all the sort of implications of SDRs and what it could really mean. And you've done a lot of research on this in CFR. But maybe before we get to it, since I think for most people they've never heard of them, what are special drawing rights, and how do they? Well, basically that's it. What are special drawing rights?
Right, so these special drawing rights is a funky term for actually a world currency. It's a combination of the euro, the dollar, the pound sterling, the yen, and the yuan, and it combines into a synthetic world currency that's actually created politically out of thin air every once in a while. Most recently, it's been created every once we have major crises, after the 2008 great financial crisis. Also, most recently, after the pandemic happened. But the SDRs have actually been around since the late 60s, when the U.S. dropped the gold standard, and the gold window was closed by President Richard Nixon, which guaranteed that any country in the world could exchange their dollars for gold. Nixon said no more. Then the world, they met at the IMF and they said we need something that replaces gold. So we're going to have this new paper gold, is what they used to call it, 40, 50 years ago. And this paper gold is what the SDRs are. So it's this international global money that can be created out of thin air from political agreement by the different countries. And it's actually then distributed or allocated, which is the term that's commonly used, to every country in the world that's an IMF member, right? And this is actually money that comes without debt. It's just like giving you paper gold. So it's a very little known, and it's distributed to every country, and that's why I research it, because it's at the core of how money actually works. And after this issuance happened a couple of years ago, many people, including the IMF chief, has said, you know what? We actually don't have a scarcity of money. If we really need to, we can issue more of these SDRs, and then we could finance, the fight against hunger, against poverty, against the climate change, and so on. So it really does shake some of the foundations of how money works.
So it is really fascinating, but of course we know that much of the mechanisms that exist throughout the institutions like the IMF, when it comes to global South countries, are meant to keep countries in perpetual debt. So I guess the question becomes, how realistic is it that this could be something that is used for real? What are the obstacles? Because at the end of the day, isn't like the actual institution of the IMF itself and who runs it one of the biggest obstacles to having a debt-free solution like this?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm a total IMF skeptic if you've seen my work. But the SDRs are actually a sort of an appendix to the main IMF institution. It has its own accounting, its own balance sheet, and it was created, like I said, in the late 60s, sort of as a response of the rest of the world to the hegemonic US dollar system. So actually, the SDRs bit are the perhaps only good thing the IMF has, because when a country receives SDRs, it is not incurring in a loan with conditionality. It doesn't have to comply with austerity conditions, or lay off a bunch of the public sector and get people to lose their jobs and so on. It does not imply any of those conditionalities. It is actually debt-free money that is allocated as a right of every member country. That's why it's so special. That's why it has broad support from the global South, developing countries, and that's exactly why we've had some initiatives by the most powerful countries that want to block a new issuance of the SDRs, right? Because it is money that comes without strings attached, without the need to incur in debt, and of course that gives more margins of freedom, degrees of freedom, sorry, to the sovereign nations of the global South. That's why we think we need a new issuance of SDRs, just like what happened 2 years ago in the context of a pandemic. But now, in the context of these rising interest rates, with very aggressive, economic and monetary policy on behalf of the United States, which is weakening global South currencies and their economies, we need these SDRs to at least try to compensate some of that harm.
I think that's such a good point. And, as more came out during the pandemic about SDRs, a chorus really started rising, and you all at CIFA were really helping lead this about, rich countries reallocating their SDRs to developing countries. And I know that there was some, then kind of big announcements. There was kind of a flurry of people to say, we're going to redistribute X amount. What do we know about that process, in terms of what was pledged versus what's really been done, and what that reflects about, where we are and what we need in the next issuance of SDRs?
Right. So we have to start with the point of how much is given to each country, right? And the unfortunate part is that 2/3 of all the SDRs that are created goes to the richest countries that don't even need them because they already have hard currencies, right? So we're saying, okay, for example, sub-Saharan Africa only gets 3.5% out of all the SDRs that are created when they need them the most. So, there's this obvious sort of reflection that says, okay, the rich countries need to give some of the SDRs to the African countries that need them the most in the context of the pandemic, that don't have hard currency, that have, implications in terms of their economies that have been weakened because of northern countries' policies and so on. But here come the rich countries and they say, sure, we're going to recycle or rechannel the SDRs, but as loans. We're going to lend them again to the poorer countries of the South African countries and so on. And for example, we have at CIPRA have put out some research that says, hey, really, there are better ways of reallocating them. They should be donations. They should be transfers. They should be, basically debt relief instead of, incurring in more debt. So we've seen that after these grand announcements by the rich countries, they haven't even put $1, one SDR yet into the coffers of the poorer countries, not even as loans. So it is the worst of worlds right now. And that's why even if the initial distribution is unfair, it still helps a lot the developing countries. That's why we need a new issuance.
I'm curious if there is a different level of enthusiasm for this from different countries. For example, US versus, let's say, China, in their positions on something like SDRs.
Well, the SDRs have been a really key point for China before the SDR basket, which is how the value of one SDR is calculated, which, by the way, you can find in the currency unit XDR. Sounds cooler. And it's about $1.3 for each SDR. But in the basket, in the SDR basket, it was only 4 currencies that were there before 2016. And during the Obama government, the Obama administration, he was able to negotiate with the Chinese, and while the US kept its veto power at the IMF, Obama conceded that as part of the SDR basket, he would include the Chinese currency, right? The renminbi. And that's important because now that internationalizes the Chinese currency, it's almost considered a hard currency now internationally. And of course, that's important for the Chinese. So yeah, the Chinese always are in favor of new issuances of SDRs because it also indirectly promotes their own currency. Unfortunately, the United States has vetoed in the past new issuances of SDRs. They try to sort of block this from happening because they don't agree with the power dynamics that follow, right? With the fact that with debt they can keep countries sort of in order, right? They discipline the countries with this debt austerity combination, but with SDRs, countries have a little bit more freedom on how to spend their money, and they usually do it spending in infrastructure, productive sector, or in the case of the pandemic, in health.
I'm glad you mentioned that, and I was hoping maybe you could give us some examples of that, because this really is not theoretical. We have seen countries put these SDRs to very good use over the past couple of years.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the SDRs have been extremely helpful. I mean, you gotta compare to the situation of the rich countries first. The rich countries, European countries, US, and so on, they could just print some more money like they did during the pandemic, infinite amounts of money. Literally, they have an agreement to print infinite amounts of money with a swap arrangement between Europe and the United States. And that's a privilege that's not available to African countries or Latin American countries. So when we got the SDRs, and I'm talking from the perspective of the South, it was our first sort of, free money kind of thing that we had in the context of the pandemic. And of course, the countries used the SDRs for very, very wholesome purposes, buying vaccines, buying health equipment, using some of that money to directly give that to people in the context of the economic recession that happened during the pandemic. And some even use them, like Senegal, to invest in their own vaccine productive capacities so that they could make their own vaccines and so forth. So I think overall the usage of the SDRs were extremely good. They were helpful. They were absolutely necessary. And that is why, for example, the African Union as a whole, over 50 countries have requested the IMF, hey, we like this. We need a new issuance. Sure, we can get some loans or whatever, but we need some SDRs again so that we can use them not just as a relief in the context of a major crisis, but to try to convert it into a development instrument, right? We also have Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados in the Caribbean, saying, hey, actually we need these SDRs, not just in the context of, end of the world type of crises. We need these SDRs every year. We need these every year, and we need these to finance climate mitigation strategies, climate adaptation strategies, fight against hunger, and so on. And yeah, it really makes you think that, if this money can be created politically, internationally, out of thin air, you could really start solving some of the major issues without dealing with debt.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it really is amazing, and perhaps that's why it's not that well known, given the possibilities are so huge. But like I said, I mean, you yourself and some other folks at CFR I know are following this closely, doing a lot of research. Where can people find some of the work that you have had the opportunity to do on SDRs?
Well, everybody can look up our research at cper.net, and also a Twitter handle, cperdc. There's all that information about SDRs. We've been working with a huge coalition of partners around the world, trying to see how they work first, what these are. They're very opaque. They've been hid from public exposure. If you talk to academic economists, that are pro, very good and knowledgeable, they have no idea that these things exist. And, if you talk to government officials, like I have been doing for the past 2 years, being like, hey, did you know you got, several $100 million worth of these SDRs? And they're like, what, really? And then they find out that it's at their central bank. And they say, hey, but I need them for the health ministry that's asking for money, in urgency. And so we really have to do a lot of work in promoting knowledge about the SDR. So yeah, look it up at the Center for Economic and Policy Research website, cper.net.
Well, Andres Arauz, I appreciate you ringing the bell on this and bringing it to my attention at the very least. And thank you again so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really is. I actually, during the pandemic in 2020, I heard this from Andres. I was shocked that this is even in existence, but it's a very creative solution to a lot of problems that I think it's very worthwhile for people to raise however they can, especially in these first world countries that, they don't need the money at all. And so there's no reason why they shouldn't do it. China, I know this year has pledged $10 billion in SDRs to African multilateral institutions. And, I'd certainly like to see the U.S. and Europe, if not match, I think go far above that in terms of their allocation. But we'll see. Biden says he's all in on Africa, so let's see.
I don't know if I want Biden to be all in on Africa. That sounds like a threat.
Yeah.
It's like a warning.
I don't know how many people do, but we shall see.
Run, Africa, run.
Yeah.
Run the other way.
Well, Rania, there's a lot of things that you and I and others have pointed out on this channel quite a bit about the war in Ukraine, that NATO's the reason why it happened, their constant eastern expansion, that is NATO's the key block to peace. And, people always say, it's Russian propaganda, it's Putin propaganda, that's this, that, and the third. So I, for one, was very interested to see that the former Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennet, was on some sort of show, podcast or whatever there in Israel, and they were asking him about, his efforts, because people may remember he was trying to become a mediator about what happened. And I was shocked, I guess, to hear some quote-unquote Putin propaganda from Naftali Bennet, but kind of an unimpeachable source, if you will. You can't really argue that this is some anti-Western person, but, making a number of interesting points, I think, that do speak to some of these other pieces. And we want to play some clips for people to see here of his commentary, which I think is very important in terms of the context of the war and where it goes next. And the first is, no matter how much people try to deny NATO is the reason for the invasion, he seemed to also state that, from his experience, that was in fact why Russia was responding.
יצאתי מאוד אופטימי, כי הוא מוותר על ההצטרפות לנאטו,
כן.
שזאת סיבת הפלישה. פוטין אמר, רק תגידו שאתם לא מצטרפים לנאטו, ואני לא אפלוש.
Well, there you go. He won't invade. All they had to do is not do this. I mean, it really is just, there it is, right there. Not Eugene, the Israeli prime minister, former Israeli prime minister. Russia did it because NATO went up to the east. A couple more clips I just want to play here, Rania, and then, perhaps there's just a few things we can say about what this all means. But there's this question of a ceasefire. And it's always said, well, Putin is not willing to do anything. The Russians aren't willing to do anything. And there's no way there could be negotiations, so on and so forth. But it seems, according to Mr. Bennet, that both sides were, in fact, willing for there to be a ceasefire.
שוב, לקח בהתחלה את השלבים הראשונים, ויש כמובן דברים שאני לא אפרט. אני רק אומר דברים שאפשר לספר. אגב, דומני שזו פעם ראשונה שאני מספר את זה. וכשאתה מקלף, אני הייתי תחת הרושם ששני הצדדים רוצים הפסקת אש. מאוד.
Both sides very much wanted a ceasefire. He's doing shuttle diplomacy. He's talking to Zelensky. He's talking to Putin. Both sides wanted a ceasefire. Well, why were there not negotiations or a ceasefire despite the fact that they were certainly on the table? Well, this next clip certainly speaks to that.
אני חושב שהייתה החלטה של המערב לגיטימית, שכרגע צריך להמשיך להכות בפוטין ולא להגיע.
אבל מה זה להכות בפוטין? פוטין ניקה באוקראינה, לא?
שנייה, לא, בסדר, אבל שאל מול, זאת אומרת, הגישה היותר תקיפה,
כן.
אני אגיד לך משהו, אני לא יודע להגיד שהם שגו.
כי אתה אומר, אולי בריונים אחרים בעולם היו רואים את זה.
העמדה שלי באותו הזמן, בעניין הזה זה לא אינטרס לאומי ישראלי.
כן.
בשונה מקונסוליה או איראן, שאני דואג לישראל, עומד חזק פה,
כן.
אין לי say. אני בסך הכל
כן.
מוציא לפועל ומתווך, אבל הכתובת שלי זה אמריקה בעניין הזה, ואני לא פועל על דעת עצמי. כל פעולה שעשיתי הייתה מתואמת לפרטי פרטים, גם עם ארצות הברית, גם עם גרמניה, גם עם צרפת.
אז הם בעצם חדלו את זה?
בגדול, כן. בגדול הם חדלו את זה, ובאותו זמן חשבתי שהם שוגים. בדיעבד, מוקדם לדעת. היתרונות והחסרונות. החיסרון של התמשכות המלחמה, זה הפגיעה הקשה בחיי אדם, באוקראינה וברוסיה. זה פגיעה מאוד קשה באוקראינה עצמה, במדינה, התשתיות שם צריך יהיה לעשות...
They blocked it.
Yeah.
That's amazing that they blocked it. I mean, it's you could have had a ceasefire, you could have had negotiations, the war never had to happen in the first place, so the NATO caused it, they prevented the ceasefire, they blocked the negotiations, and again, it's not Eugene per year, it's the former prime minister of Israel. So, I don't know, maybe Putin is controlling him, I don't know, but I mean, it's just, I don't know, it's just, but none of this made it into the U.S. media, despite the fact that they love Israel. I mean, it just says everything you need to know about the war in Ukraine.
Well, the U.S. has been a little bit offended since the war in Ukraine started because Israel has not taken a strong position on the side of the U.S. or NATO, and that's because obviously we know Israel's
all the settlers are from Russia and Brooklyn.
Well, that's part of it. That's a big part of it, right? Obviously, we do know that Israel's a client state of the U.S., but it has a very good relationship with Russia. It has a huge Russian settler population that supports the government in Russia, so there's more space for politicians in Israel to be both pro-Russia and pro-US. And also, Israel does have a close relationship with Russia. And they want to maintain that close relationship. Like the Israelis also have their own self-interests when it comes to having a good relationship with Russia. For example, they coordinate with the Russians when they strike at Syria, for example, because they don't want to accidentally hit the Russians. Because they don't want a war with Russia. They don't want a bad relationship with Russia. Because I think this also plays into what starts to happen in a more multipolar world, Eugene, in the sense that Russia's a big power. Countries don't want Russia to be their enemy because they don't get anything out of Russia being their enemy. And the same goes for China. So just because Israel is America's greatest ally in the Middle East, just like Saudi Arabia is, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're seeing either of these countries actually get on board with the U.S. proxy war in Ukraine. Quite the contrary, they want to maintain a good relationship with these other emerging powers. And as a result, I think that's why you see an Israeli figure like Naftali Bennet unafraid to just be honest about the realities of this war.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. Sell a lot of high technology to Russia and China, and yeah, the dynamics of this, I don't know. I was thinking about it this morning. I was wondering if part of the reason maybe why he did this is that he's upset that the U.S. didn't help him stay in power, for longer.
I'm sure.
Because there was the whole drama with Netanyahu and who's now back, and Bennett was supposed to be this new face that was kind of presenting himself as more friendly to the international community, like, I'm a genocidal maniac, but I'm going to be like way more low key about my genocidal sociopathy. So you will be able to do more to pretend that Israel is good, not bad. Like that was kind of his sort of myth making, image making. This is why I'm better than Netanyahu. But of course, I mean, not that the West didn't support him, but they didn't go out of their way like they do sometimes in Israeli politics to like sideline Netanyahu permanently for Bennet. And I thought this was a nice little elbow to throw at them to show that they were responsible for the Ukraine war.
Also a little like salt in the or in the wound, or there's no wound here. That's a bad analogy. Let's drop that. Also, just like trying to basically poke at the Biden administration, right?
Yeah.
Like if this was happening under the Trump administration, you may see a little bit more hesitation from right-wing Israeli figures, but it's happening during the Biden administration when the right-wingers in Israel are happy to openly express their disagreements and disgust with like what they see as the liberals in America who don't support like the greater Israel project that they get from like a Trump administration. So it might also make that easier for him to just like call out the Americans. Like I wonder if he would have made similar comments if Trump was in power.
Yeah, it's interesting. Hopefully we'll never have to find out, but perhaps we will, depending on what happens in 2024. But yeah, no, it's interesting and it's notable. And the thing to me is like it was huge on Twitter, and that's how I found it because people were sharing it, all around the world. Like this is exactly what the whole world is saying, and it's notable because of course we're singling out Naftali Bennet here because Israel is eminently acceptable in the American discourse, and even the former Israeli prime minister can't break through to the mainstream news when he's saying things like NATO caused the war in Ukraine, there was a ceasefire, I had it set up and they blocked it, all these other things. But this is the whole world. I mean, Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, said the exact same thing. Lula, who is the president of Brazil, I mean, he actually said he thought Zelensky was more responsible than Putin. We've seen the head of the African Union come out and say that he felt that the war, which should end right away, was, something there is blame to be had on both sides. I mean, we've seen it from India, we've seen it from China, we've seen it from basically every other part of the world. This is actually considered to be basic knowledge. And this is not, but the way it's presented is, all these countries in the global south, they just support Russia. They just love Putin. Some of them obviously do support Russia. Some of them obviously do have good relations with Putin, but some of them don't. But this is just still across the political spectrum in many of the global south nations, almost all of them, the basic just common sense. Like, yeah, of course, NATO going eastward played a huge role. Like, it does seem true that there could have been more of a negotiation and they stopped it. But it just shows that for the Western media, the voices from the global south don't count. If you're an African leader, if you're a Latin American leader, if you're an Asian leader, and you're trying to push back and say, wait a second, guys, let's take a step back. Let's maybe move towards peace and away from war. Nevertheless, you're just cast aside as someone who is just, being manipulated. The New York Times, did this article on a woman who is a legislator in Guinea-Bissau. And she'd been a freedom fighter from Guinea-Bissau. And, she was expressing some pretty pro-Russian views. And they were presenting her as like some sort of bizarre aberration. Like, can you believe this person in the Guinea-Bissau legislature would have this position when this is, almost everyone in Africa has a similar position. But the Times article would never really reveal that to you, And I think Americans are deeply, deeply mistaken by thinking that somehow the position of the U.S. and Europe, like Biden said in the State of the Union, we had a global coalition. There is no global coalition. America and Europe, South Korea and Japan. That's the coalition. No other country is imposing any sanctions on Russia. Every other country has called for negotiations and for peace. But you can still say there's a global coalition, and no one in the U.S. media is going to question it. I mean, it's as absurd as Bush saying we have a coalition of the willing to go into Iraq. But here we are.
Yeah, I mean, the majority of the world, if you want to talk about a global coalition, the majority of the world is, like you said, not partaking in sanctions on Russia. So, in fact, it shows you, if you really look at things objectively, that the U.S. and its coalition are the marginal ones, not the other way around.
No, it's true. I mean, you had the African Union was screaming into the void, apparently, that the Western sanctions on Russia were interfering with their ability to buy food, to bring in food, to get humanitarian aid in. And over and over and over again, you had the U.S. and European officials say, well, this is not true. And it's like the entire continent of Africa is consistently saying, like, no, we are the ones who are receiving the food. And we're telling you that it's not coming, and that the companies are telling us it's because of your sanctions. And then, of course, what happened is Europe quietly, without any fanfare, changed the rules because the sanctions were, in fact, making it difficult for food to come in. Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the UN ambassador for the United States, then goes to Africa and makes this big demonstrative statement about how everyone can buy food and fertilizer from Russia. So implicitly, recognizing, yes, we were, in fact, increasing world hunger and rising prices of food around the globe. But it didn't matter. It didn't, as long as the Africans as long as it's Africans, then you can just go ahead and you can ignore it. Though it's absurd. But
well, they would have imagined it. I mean, it is Africa. They may have just been collectively imagining, some sort of a nefarious American. I don't even know. Like it really is incredible. No, but they do this with everything, just like they're doing with Syria now, with these, insisting that our sanctions aren't preventing aid. Well, then are we in Lebanon and Iraq and any American organization trying to find a way to help Syria? Is everybody just collectively imagining that your sanctions on the Syrian central bank make it impossible to send aid to this country after an earthquake? Or are you maybe lying? I mean,
you may be. Well,
you may be lying.
There's certainly some confirmation now from certainly an impeachable source, but obviously the exact kind of source that would lead you to believe that this is the truth, not just something that's made up propaganda of Russia. But we'll leave that for where it is. We want to get ready to turn to our next story. Also, terrible situation here in this country, just shameful, really. But, the recent mass shooting that we saw in Half Moon Bay, tragic shooting there, has put a spotlight on a critically important issue, and that is the just completely substandard conditions that many farm workers in the United States are forced to endure day in and day out as they do the important labor to actually make sure that, those of us living in major cities actually have food to eat. And we are very, very honored to be joined for this conversation by Dr. Ann Lopez, who is the executive director of the Center for Farm Worker Families. Dr. Lopez, thank you so much for being with us.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, it is really our honor to have you here, and obviously all of us, we hate to see what happened in Half Moon Bay, but it did, I think, open the eyes of a lot of people around the country to, especially the issues of substandard housing for farm workers. And I was just hoping you could talk a little bit about that issue specifically, because I think you have the food on your plate, but you aren't thinking exactly where it comes from.
That's right. No, that's absolutely well stated. There is no affordable, decent housing for farm workers that I've discovered. The only exception is in the state's, California's 24 migrant camps, but that housing is only available from usually the 1st of April till the end of November, and then farm workers have to move away. And there was a regulation called the 50-mile regulation where they had to move at least 50 miles in order to come back to the same unit. We got that postponed, but it's due to come back in 2024 in January, and we're working now to get it rescinded completely because it's there's really no reason for it. I've been asking, what is the purpose of the 50-mile regulation for at least 10 years, and no one's given me an answer. So my conclusion is it's to guarantee the next generation of farm workers, because the children have to go to too many schools and can't be successful academically. So the migrant camps, yes, they have decent, affordable housing, but people have to pick up and move every year. That's one. Another one is Mid-Peninsula Housing Authority, a nonprofit that provides beautiful housing for farm workers. However, to get a unit in their buildings takes being on a waiting list at least from 5 to 7 years. So the majority of farm workers live in really terrible conditions, in my opinion. Oftentimes what I've seen is as many as 19 people crammed into 1,000 square feet. They tell me they have to line up in the morning to use the bathroom. Oftentimes these units are not maintained. They have cockroaches, rats, mold, etc. And so the landlords really have the final say, because if someone complains, they can tell them to leave, and they'll have the unit rented by the afternoon. Housing is so scarce. So we really need a safety net for farm workers, especially with housing. And I think that as the fourth largest economy in the world, we should be able to provide that. I mean, these people live in constant fear of deportation. The majority, in California at least, are undocumented. And one of the places they hide is where they're living. And when they're living in such gross conditions, it's not a very pleasant experience. So you're absolutely right. We're not doing what we need to do as a state to support these people. In fact, I don't think this is any way to treat human beings, frankly. To me, it's a leftover from slavery in the South. And California was destined to be a slave state. However, since it can't be a slave state and needs exploited labor, rather than slavery, we've got agricultural exceptionalism, regulations, laws, policies, etc., that keep them trapped and from which escape is nearly impossible, especially carrying the burden of being undocumented. And I frankly don't think that anybody who's worked in the fields weeks, months, or years should be worried about deportation. What would we do without these people? The entire industrial food system is dependent on them. We need transformation.
Can you talk a bit more about that? I mean, what you've already described as far as living conditions could go is grotesque. But can you talk a bit about the working conditions that these people have to endure?
Yes. Basically, what I've discovered is that there are laws on the books, labor laws, to protect farm workers. However, oftentimes they're not enforced. So I'll get calls from the field about how they're spraying pesticides close by farm workers who are working. People are starting to faint, vomit, feeling dizzy, etc. All the symptoms of pesticide poisoning. I call the agricultural commissioner. He sends out a group to investigate at the farm, and the farm workers won't talk because they're afraid of being deported or blacklisted. In the Watsonville area, I've seen a figure as high as 84% of farm workers as undocumented workers. So that's one. Then the UC Davis and the Southern Poverty Law Center did a study and found that 60 to 80% of farm worker women are sexually harassed, groped, or outright raped in the field. And recently I got a call from a woman who had been raped in the field, and it was her hysteria I still am recovering from. And so again, no oversight. this last September, there was it was 100 to 108 in the hills, and the farm workers begged the supervisor at a farm to let them go because it was too hot. And then they started fainting. And so I got a call about them fainting. See, it's like they're not considered on some level as human beings worthy of dignity and respect. And that needs to change.
I'm glad you raised that, because I mean, it really does feel that this is like a category of labor that, is exempt from so many different things. And I know that, because of the efforts of farm workers, there's some more protections in California for collective bargaining, but not that much. And we've seen some even further erosions of that, heat standards, all these things. I mean, it just feels that there is exactly what you said, that to some degree we've created this, I don't even want to call it second-class citizenship because it feels worse than that, for farm workers that we've normalized.
Yeah, yes, we've normalized it. It's exactly the same thing. There are 3 schools in the Watsonville area surrounded by fields that are regularly sprayed by Telone 1,3-dichloropropene. It is a Prop 65 carcinogen. And I meet children of farm workers all the time with various anomalies related to pesticide exposure, cancer, birth defects, ADHD, autism spectrum, learning disabilities. This in the face of their parents wanting them to become educated and out of farm work. They come here mostly for their children. And what gets them in the field in the morning is thinking of their children having a better life. And then they're exposed to these awful chemicals. I mean, we're fighting this right now. We've got a group called CORA, Campaign for Organic Regenerative Agriculture. We want to convert all of Santa Cruz County, to begin with, to organic regenerative agriculture, because that's the only way these children will be protected. And it's amazing to me that it's so common in Watsonville, and yet you don't hear outcries. Now, if this was going on in a wealthy city somewhere, there would be lawsuits, there would be headlines, you can bet it would be a real commotion across the country. But in Watsonville, because these people are poor and exploited, nothing is done. It's just like, oh, well, she goes to Stanford every month for treatment and we give her pills at home, kind of thing. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could also because it's not that any workers in any industry deserve to be living in conditions as horrible as this, or be working in conditions as horrible as this. But of course, the great irony here is that the work these people are doing feeds the country. Can you talk a little bit about, can you talk a bit about what that actually is? Like, what is it that these people are doing that we should be thinking about when we're eating or buying food, for example?
Well, they're doing back-breaking labor. In the past, about 10 years ago, the average life expectancy of a farm worker was 49 years. Now, if you compare that to people in other sectors, you can see that's quite diminished. Much of the work will make them disabled for the rest of their life because they're bent over 8 hours a day minimum, sometimes up to 10 hours a day. They live in constant poverty and they don't get paid enough to buy decent food. So the diabetes incidence and also high cholesterol incidence is over the top. We have, to give you an example, about 3 or 4 years ago, I visited a Oaxacan family and their children were crying. And I asked what was wrong with the children. And they said, they're hungry and we don't have food. And I said, well, why don't you have food? Because we're not working and have no money. And these children were crying and crying for food. And this is, again, within the community, it's normalized. This is how it has to be. And I told him, I said, we're not doing that here. So we call Second Harvest Food Bank, and that afternoon they brought out food for 144 families. And since then, every second Friday of the month, we have what we call a distribution where families can come and get the food they need, clothes, household goods. We have an acupuncturist, masseuse, chiropractor, all forms of, we've had 3 COVID clinics, but no one is taking care of these people, and somebody needs to make this a priority. So now we're certain that no one is starving, at least. But shouldn't they have priority since they're providing us with food? I mean, my goodness. I always think to myself, it's so interesting to me that the country and so many people are concerned about whether the food they're eating is organic or non-GMO. How about the labor conditions of the human beings behind this food? No one talks about that. They're like an invisible workforce that is just tossed under the rug. When they die, there's no obituaries. You're talking about housing. People have tried to live on the Pajaro River because they have no money for rent. And 10 years ago or so, a gentleman died because the river rose in the night during a storm and he drowned. Another incident was a garage that was freezing cold in the winter that was being rented. And the inhabitants, 2 men, set up a barbecue to warm the garage and died of carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, none of these incidents reached the obituary columns of the newspaper. Why is that? Why aren't farm workers important enough in the community when they do such important bottom line work? I mean, it's like I think about the rich Silicon Valley executives just over the hill who are making, triple digit or 6-digit figure salaries, and they're completely dependent on the food that is harvested by these people, these farm workers. And I just find it very interesting that the entire society is based on the food that's produced, and yet the farm workers are treated so horrifically. This really has to change.
And it raises such a good point in a way. I mean, because I think, for a lot of us, we've been seeing, in this crisis of inflation, I mean, the cost of food is just skyrocketing. So obviously these big agribusiness companies just have to be making huge sums of money, which, I mean, regardless, this would be horrible, but it feels like such a glaring difference between what is obviously going to these big companies and, how it's not trickling down in any way, shape, or form to the farm workers.
Well, that's true. I mean, we've got many millionaire and more farmers or company owners in the Watsonville area that hire farm workers for less than minimum wage. And I should mention that wage theft is common. So a farm worker does not have a contract with the employer, goes to work for them for a week, goes to collect their income or their wages, and the employer says, "Go away, or I'll call and have you deported." I mean, this is the kind of thing they experience.
Well, sorry, Ronnie, did I cut you off?
Well, there was one last thing that I just wanted to get some clarity on, because you briefly referenced this when you opened, and that's about the issue of, you mentioned schools that their children go to and how these schools are used to kind of like trap generations into this sort of farm work. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, education is really important to farm workers. They want their kids educated. In fact, in some of my interviews, I talked to a couple of fathers that said, I tell my kids that they either come home from school and do their homework or go with me out in the field and pick and work in the field all day. And they tell me that after a day in the field, the children decide to do their homework. It's an easy one there. But in the school situation is in the migrant camp situation, where if they have to move 50 miles away, then that means that their children in the middle of the year will have to change schools. And many of them fall further and further behind, and they drop out of school and then oftentimes join the gangs in Watsonville or become farm workers themselves. So I see it as a great way to guarantee the next generation of farm workers. And we fought that now for years, and we've got another fight coming up before January to get rid of this 50-mile regulation.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Lopez, where can people find out more about what you all are doing at the Center for Farm Worker Families along with your allies?
Yeah, you can just go on our website, farmworkerfamily.org.
Well, Dr. Ann Lopez, Executive Director of the Center for Farm Worker Families, we really appreciate you joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really unbelievable situation. I know some people say, oh, it's not that unbelievable, but, it's outrageous, that's for sure. Something Bill Ayers actually told me once many years ago, as he said, the more you do in terms of unveiling the ills of capitalism, the more you become desensitized. And he was like, the most important thing is never lose your sense of outrage, because even if you expect it, it is outrageous and people should be outraged. And you think, we're all eating all the time. And I'm not saying don't eat, but the fact that there's subhuman conditions that people are forced to toil in and toil under, in the context of the production of this food is just atrocious.
No, completely. It's unbelievably disgraceful is what it is. And I mean, I appreciate that she equated it with like a modern day form of slavery and related it to the issue of agriculture, because the fact is that a lot of agriculture is still done in labor like in slavery like conditions, and it's across the country. I mean, we have people who pick fruit in Georgia, for example, who are in similar situations, in slave-like conditions. It's oftentimes undocumented people who have no rights, which makes it so much easier to use and abuse and mistreat them. So yeah, I mean, it's absolutely terrible, and I'm glad that we have the space to have someone on to talk about that. I really quickly want to remind people that there's a couple ways they can support the show. And one of those ways is you can donate directly on YouTube, depending on if you're in one of the countries that can, which is most of where our audience is. And you can also become a patron at patreon.com/breakthrough news. Always got to throw that out there. And a reminder that if we can get 50 patrons throughout the month of February, Eugene will start an Instagram account where he will post about the farm workers and the other various topics that we are covering on each and every one of these shows.
No,
Look at that lower third.
And I was just looking down, doing a little research just to, enlighten people. Interesting union to check out historically, the United Cannery, Agriculture, Packing, and Allied Workers of America, UCAPWA. That's a big one. United Cannery, Agriculture, Packing, and Allied Workers of America. Just rewind it on YouTube. But it speaks very much to this because this was one of the most progressive unions in the 1930s and 40s. They organized black tobacco workers in North Carolina. They organized agricultural workers in California in the 1930s. Big strikes around cotton and other things there in the Central Valley. Some of the things, if you know, the Grapes of Wrath, the farm worker conditions, these were the sorts of things that were happening there. But really, really interesting story. Pecan shellers in Texas, and this very interesting, left-led, communist-led union organizing mainly black and Chicano and Japanese workers in the fields in the South, throughout the Southwest, and up into the Central Valley in California. Some of the more interesting history, I think, in this country of people actually coming together for the right thing. Good book called Radicals in the Barrio, and also Civil Rights Unionism, two different books that touch on that. But, Rania, one other sort of notable story that goes back to something we discussed here on this issue is the recent expose, if you will, by Seymour Hersh on his own Medium site, which can say a lot. People don't know Seymour Hersh, of course, revealed the My Lai massacre and a number of other major things. Very famous reporter in American history. But on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, coming in and really following on what a lot of people were saying at the time, Rania, from open source information, that he is confirmed with at least one source in the U.S. government, that the U.S. was in fact behind the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I know you saw that. I think you sent me this story. I'm curious how it struck you.
Well, yeah, I mean, not surprising in the sense of like, did we really think it was anybody but the U.S.? But of course, you got to love Seymour Hersh because he'll have his own sources inside the U.S. government who can help verify what we all suspect to be the case. And in this case, I mean, one thing that really got me about the whole Nord Stream 2 pipeline explosion is that within like a couple days of it happening, we never heard about it in the Western media again. Which to me suggests there was no evidence that, because they were initially trying to say, oh, Russia must have done it. To me, it suggests that they had no evidence that Russia would have done it. Plus, the only people who really benefit and who have said and also celebrated the explosion, the sabotaging of this pipeline is people in the U.S. government. So I guess, like, to me, it's like just confirming what I already assumed to be the case. But of course, to come from somebody like Seymour Hersh, because who, as you mentioned, I mean, he's a legend. He's published lots of exposés throughout his career, including exposing the My Lai massacre, as well as, you know, throughout the war on terror, lots of exposés on various issues. He got a lot of attention. And one of the reasons that you don't see him published in mainstream publications anymore is because after the 2013 sarin gas attack in Syria, he showed through his own U.S. government sources that one of the reasons the Obama administration did not follow through on, you know, bombing Syria after the so-called red line was breached, the red line being chemical weapons use, was because they were uncertain whether it was in fact the Syrian government or whether it was perhaps opposition groups connected to Al-Qaeda that had carried out this attack. And so the point being that, you know, that's a big deal if people inside the U.S. government aren't even sure who did it, that they couldn't follow through on a bombing campaign over that pretext. You know, Seymour Hersh also wrote a really important piece. I want to say it was for the New Yorker. I'm not 100% sure. It was for some big mainstream publication. I still remember it was in 2007. And I think it's called, I want to say, the redirection or the realignment. It's one of those terms, but it's about the Bush administration allying with the Saudis to basically switch gears in the Middle East from essentially like backing this fight against Sunni extremist Al-Qaeda groups to turning those Sunni extremist Al-Qaeda groups into tools against the big bad Shias that are supported by, you know, Iran and Hezbollah across the region. So basically starting a war of both like through the media as well as actually funding and arming groups in places like Iraq and Lebanon to like really plant the seeds for what would become like just this like wave of extremism across the Middle East, just to, you know, go against Iran. So anyways, the point being that Seymour Hersh, very important journalist. It's really big that he now has this story out about Nord Stream. And also you mentioned Medium. I think it was on Substack, not Medium. Sorry. Which shows you, well, the reason I brought up all those stories though, is that it's actually another aspect of the Seymour Hersh report is that it was published at Substack, independently published by him, probably because he's pretty much been blacklisted from anything mainstream in the U.S. since that piece in 2013 on the sarin gas attack in Syria.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting to see him there. I think that 2007 article is the New Yorker. Yeah, I mean, you know, look, it's interesting. There's differing views on it. I mean, obviously, there was a huge amount of open source information that was sort of pointing to this, the Balto ops that he mentioned, and the role of the Norwegian helicopters. And people were like looking at all these different things, seeing things leaving Poland air bases, how they the press release from the U.S. government about these exercises, quote unquote, was like they were going down to do some undersea cable something. So, then you had a very sort of Israeli-like approach from the U.S. officials like Victoria Nuland, Antony Blinken, where like everyone knows Israel did something, and then they're like, oh, we didn't do it, wink, wink, nod, nod, ha, 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 we actually did do it kind of thing. And it was like the U.S. definitely taking a page from that book. But to have someone like Seymour Hersh, who everyone knows does have sources in the government, always has, I mean, sort of the role he historically played in the context of the U.S. was he was sort of the conduit of choice for people who wanted to leak information that potentially made the government look bad. And all his sources sort of famously were always anonymous, and that was the thing. It's like no one knew exactly who it was, but this was like he had the line into the deep state. That's who he was known as. So everyone knows he knows people in all these different little nooks and crannies hiding in the shadows. So to have all the open source reporting from the internet. But I guess that raises a whole other question. This is not to rip Seymour Hersh, but it's an interesting point about journalism and the changes that we've seen since, the WikiLeaks era and Julian Assange bringing out WikiLeaks, and the rise of the internet is the rise of people doing, pretty good journalism just from the information that's publicly available. And then to have it come around and have a very august journalist sort of confirm and co-sign that and add to it by bringing in, the sources that people know they have, I think was important. But, as the lower third there at the bottom says, I think it's pretty clear from the beginning. I mean, why would Russia ever have done this? I mean, they needed this. This is the whole point. They were trying to sell gas into Europe. Nobody possibly in Russia, this was the biggest chip they had against Europe, is to say, well, you guys don't have any gas. We can turn on the gas on Nord Stream 2. Everything's going to be fine. All the prices are going to go down. All you got to do is stop supporting Ukraine. So it was actually the biggest leverage they had against Western Europe to get them to not support Ukraine. Why on earth would they give that up? I mean, there is literally no world in which that would make any sense whatsoever. And so, I think it fell out of the media so fast because it was so nonsensical. They had to just kind of whitewash it, because to actually think it through for 20 seconds, it wasn't confusing. And we've seen since then, Sweden, these other countries, they're keeping the information secret from their, various different investigations and stuff. Why are they keeping it secret? If it was so clearly Russia, don't you think they'd want to reveal that? So, very, very big bombshell interview. But I think that more or less will bring us to the end of the show here today, Rania. It's a sad moment, of course, for us and I'm sure for our viewers, but don't worry, this is not the last show. We'll be back with you as we always are, but good time to remind you, of course, if you haven't already, hit subscribe, hit the bell so you can get all the alerts for all the things you subscribe to, including dispatches from Rania Khalek, which is fantastic, I must say. And you can, of course, go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. Anything else you want to say, Rania?
Yes, I want to remind people that we have a campaign. I will do this several times every show until the end of February. We have a campaign. 50 new patrons in the month of February, and Eugene per year will start an Instagram account where he will not only be on Instagram, exist on Instagram, he will post on Instagram.
Oh my God. And by the way, I never actually agreed to that, but to show how much I care about our viewers, I am agreeing to. You brought that in subsidiarily.
That is a liar.
But that's fine.
No. We have verbal agreements throughout the last few weeks that we can definitely pull clips from, and we will if we have to, Eugene.
Wow. Diesel fumes from that generator, not really helping. But nevertheless, it doesn't matter what I did or did not agree to originally or how people tried to, snow me under here, but I will do it. I will post. Anyway, long story short, that's going to do it for us here.
Hang on, Matt, make sure you clip that. Sorry, go ahead, Eugene. I just want to make sure we
end the show before you say anything else. That's going to do it for us here on the Freedom Side from Breakthrough News, and we will see you next time.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
We did it, Joe.